Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, managing editor of Shadowproof, and I'm pleased to be joined by Gareth Porter, who is an independent investigative journalist who has covered national security policy since 2005. He was the recipient of the Gellhorn Prize for Journalism in 2012. His most recent book is The CIA Insider's Guide to the Iran Crisis, which he co authored with John Kiriakou. That was published, I believe, last year or a couple of years ago.
Early,
And
but
yep. Early in 2020. And he recently published the article, How CENTCOM Chief McKenzie Manufactured an Iran Crisis to Increase His Power Over at the Grayzone. So he's a Grayzone contributor. And I wanted to have him on to talk about this article, the end of the Trump administration, and how we see the policy toward Iran forming in the Biden administration. So thank you for joining us, Gareth.
my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, Kevin.
And so let me just say, we have a few dozen people. I expect some more people to join us throughout our conversation. If anyone has any questions for Gareth, I'm happy to work them in along the way so that we can, include people here who are kindly taking some time out of their day to follow this important conversation here, especially when, war could be at stake if we don't get this correct. We're talking about a powerful country in the Middle East that we do not want to antagonize unnecessarily, because there will be repercussions. So blowback is obviously something to discuss. But if you could begin first with who is this CENTCOM chief, General Kenneth McKenzie. I'm positive most people watching have no idea who he is in the U.S. government and exactly what he was doing to become a driving force for tensions with Iran in the final days of the Trump administration.
Right. You're absolutely correct. I'm sure that General McKenzie, Kenneth F. McKenzie, is not at all well known. In fact, most people may have just barely seen his name, and that's about all. But he has become arguably, not just arguably, I think without any question, the most powerful individual in the US military in terms of the entire Middle East and beyond. He is the one who has really been able to pull the strings necessary in order to manipulate US policy, and to do so in a way that has built up his power to a degree that I think no other general in recent memory, a commanding general in the US military, has been able to accomplish. And he's done that essentially by creating, as the title of the article that you just cited suggests, creating an artificial crisis on Iran, which was very carefully calculated by McKenzie himself to add immeasurably to his own status and power within the military. Now, McKenzie became the commanding general of Central Command, that is the command that controls the action throughout the Middle East, all the way from Afghanistan down through the Gulf. And now, of course, including, just at the end of the Trump administration, Israel for the first time, although they were never included before. And he became CENTCOM commander in 2018, just as John Bolton was becoming the incoming national security advisor for Trump. And that combination was responsible then for the first real Iran crisis in the Trump administration. And that crisis occurred in May of 2018, which was over essentially nothing. Nothing had really happened. But what happened, in fact, was McKenzie had asked for a carrier task group, an aircraft carrier task group that has, of course, a lot of airplanes connected with it, which can carry out bombing. and a B-52 task force to be sent to the Middle East under his command, and on the excuse that there were what John Bolton called troubling signs of Iranian intentions to do something, which were, the intentions not made clear to anyone by Bolton in his statement. And essentially, as I say, this was an artificial construct. There was nothing going on there except for the sort of normal actions that allies of Iran take to prepare for a potential conflict with the United States and Israel. And of course, that could be any number of things, but they were taking advantage of that to suggest that there was this new danger of an Iranian attack on American troops or diplomats in the Middle East. And many of your listeners will recall that there was a period of weeks there where there was a high degree of crisis atmosphere in Washington, with almost daily press articles suggesting, based on leaks from sources close to Bolton and McKenzie, that they had evidence of Iranian intentions or plans to do something that could harm U.S. personnel. And of course, it turned out, if you really looked into it carefully, that they didn't have anything. There was simply no intelligence that would support that. So that was the beginning of the McKenzie era, if you will, in the Middle East as CENTCOM commander. And that then brings us to the more recent period over the past year, basically, that you have had a new period of attempted efforts by McKenzie to suggest that there was a crisis. And I think this is what my article for Grayzone, published about 10 days ago, was really all about. And this article, I think, shows that McKenzie's actions represent a kind of perfect example, which I want to come back to. Hopefully we'll have some time to get into this a little bit. A perfect example of how the US military operates more generally, to use excuses that are based on mostly thin air, or simply taking advantage of defensive maneuvers by other actors to suggest that they need to build up their own forces to prepare for conflict, a potential conflict. In other words, it is an example of how the military basically enhances its own power and assures the continuation of that power over long periods of time by essentially creating false crises or semi-crises. And in this case, it was a false crisis, again, over the idea that that Iran was preparing for, or might be preparing for, some kind of action that would coincide with the first anniversary of the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, the very famous and very popular within Iran and among Shiites throughout the Middle East, commander of the IRGC Quds force abroad. And the idea was that that they had a reason to believe, and this meant McKenzie had reason to believe, that Iran would carry out some kind of action. They couldn't be any more precise about that. But the story really begins even before there was a suggestion of a crisis over January 4th, 2021, because of Iraq. And the idea here was that McKenzie wanted to get more and more troops in the Middle East and more forces in the Middle East, and he faced a threat to that aspiration because of the Pentagon's having a new set of priorities, because of great power competition as the main theme of the Pentagon, beginning in 2017, 2018. They were planning to move troops and other military assets out of the Middle East to Europe and to the Pacific, the Indo-Pacific region. So he was trying to buck that trend by trying to suggest that there was much more threat from Iran than was being taken into account, and that it was necessary to have more permanent forces in the Middle East at a higher level. So the first thing he did was to try to suggest that Iraq was terribly important and that he wanted to keep as many troops in Iraq as possible. Well, the Iraqis had a veto power over that. And the Iraqi militias, who were aligned with Iran and who were highly nationalistic and who had no use for US troops whatsoever. And so what they did was to begin to carry out attacks on the bases in Iraq where US troops were located. And the very first attack, beginning in March of 2020, killed two US servicemen. And they continued those attacks regularly over the next 6 months and essentially succeeded in forcing the United States military to retreat from those bases where the US was located. And that meant essentially a major reduction in US troops in Iraq from the original 8,000 down to about 3,000 by September, October of 2020. So it was a big defeat for General McKenzie. And so he was really desperate for some way to try to buck up his fortunes in the face of these negative trends. And the solution that he came up was the one that I suggested, that there was reason to believe that Iran was planning something on the January 4th anniversary of the Soleimani assassination. And so he exploited that as much as he could, and he did so by exploiting his contacts with US and foreign media. He did much more in that regard than any other commander, to my knowledge, has ever done. He had regular press conferences, regular press briefings, and interviews with the media, including one round-robin briefing or meeting with at least 5 major news outlets. And he used that to peddle his themes, particularly the idea that there was greater risk associated with the January 4th date. And he succeeded in getting the media to pick that up. And he was hoping that that would put pressure on the Pentagon to go along with particularly his demand to have a permanent or semi-permanent carrier task group remain in the Middle East. That was the thing that he wanted most. And that was up in the air, particularly after November 4th, after the defeat of Trump and the replacement of the Secretary of Defense Mark Esper by someone who was a Trump loyalist and who was much less dedicated to the interests of the various commanders and was willing to go along with Trump's desire to get out of the Middle East much faster. And so he turned up the heat and tried to get the media to play this in a much more urgent way. And what he did was to begin to carry out, he demanded and got B-52 sorties, B-52 round-trip flights from the United States to the Middle East, going along Iran's airspace, very close to Iran's airspace, and then returning back home. He did that 4 times between November and the late December. And the result of that, of course, was to raise tensions in the Middle East. The Iranians responded to that with some moves of their own. He then exploited that to try to tell the media that the Iranians were creating a greater risk. And in general, he tried to create this new level of a crisis around the Middle East. It didn't work ultimately. Chris Miller, the new acting Secretary of Defense, actually made the decision to pull back the Nimitz aircraft carrier strike group, which upset him very much. And he apparently then went to his Joint Chiefs of Staff colleagues, allies, got them to try to put pressure on Trump, and Trump then apparently reversed the decision a couple of days later. So that was a triumph, at least temporarily, for McKenzie, and that's kind of the way it ended. Of course, January 4th came and went, nothing happened. It turned out that was a complete fiction, that there was any danger of an Iranian move on that date. It's simply been created for the purpose of creating a false sense of crisis.
Right, and so just a clarifying question. Is it your sense that the reason why we've wanted to keep such a presence in Iraq is to be able to so easily counter Iran if it would be necessary? Is that part of the calculus? Is there any sort of, I mean, when I read through your article about McKenzie, I got the sense that there might be some kind of a assertion that if we could leave these longer to counter ISIS, we also have these forces available to use to counter Iran if we would need to.
Well, you're absolutely right, of course, Kevin, that the idea of countering Iran is central to the mission of the military at this point in the Middle East. I mean, that's really a major point that they're emphasizing to justify maximizing the power and the effectiveness, the capabilities that are available to them. But I think it's really important to understand the distinction between the rationale that they're using to justify this and the fundamental underlying motivation, which is essentially that the military always wants to maximize the military assets that are available to locally as well as globally. And in the case of CENTCOM, that means having a carrier task group, which was a symbol of US power for decades in the Middle East. And McKenzie, as the CENTCOM commander, is acting like essentially any other CENTCOM commander would act. He covets that Nimitz, in this case, the aircraft carrier task group, as that symbol of US power. It's a matter of prestige. It's a matter of his own personal ability to show that he can get the US power and maintain it. And so I think that's the underlying motive that is propelling McKenzie's behavior here. And that is why I began this sort of discussion of the events of the past year under McKenzie in the Middle East by saying that McKenzie's behavior is a perfect example of the fundamental underlying principle and pattern of behavior of the US military generally. And that is that they always want to maximize their power, to maximize the assets that they have available everywhere in the world, in this case in the Middle East. And they will always come up with the biggest excuse, the biggest basis for justifying that power and those missions that they can justify, that they can come up with. So I think that's the underlying motivation. That's the thing that we should understand as the real problem that we face trying to reform, or as I would prefer to put it, to essentially scale down the power of the Pentagon to a point where it can really be controlled by a democratic system, which it cannot today at all.
Mm-hmm. And so McKenzie, he's still at CENTCOM, right? He's still the chief
Absolutely.
of CENTCOM
Yes.
at this moment, right? Okay.
At
I
this
just want to
moment.
make sure I followed that. There's been no changing of the guard. There's no other replacement for him. So that brings me to where I think we can transition into a discussion about Biden. You laid out in basic detail what the timeline of events were under Trump when it came to Iran. Of course, I reemphasize that this involves the abandonment of the JCPOA, or the Iran nuclear deal, as it's more commonly referred. And so people like McKenzie, who did not leave with the larger Trump administration, who we had many people who were advocates of a more kind of belligerent policy towards Iran, who have left with Trump, who are not there with Joe Biden. But then you have the bureaucrats and you have the people who remain there, who have become invested in the policy shift that Donald Trump was taking. I suppose my question, what I'm kind of framing here, is there, and in addition to those people, you also have the right-wing political elites in the Senate and the House of Representatives that are going to push for a continuation of Trump's belligerent foreign policy towards Iran, and not favor a cooling off. You see this in the way that someone like Robert Menendez questions Antony Blinken. And so my question to you is, I'll start with the chatter we've heard about who could be the special envoy to Iran to potentially make this deal happen again. And maybe this isn't the best entry point. Maybe there's going to be more power that lies with Antony Blinken and the State Department, who I'd like to get to next after this. But let's start with how it seems neoconservatives are preemptively trying to make it impossible for Joe Biden to appoint someone like Rob Malley to be the special envoy to Iran, trying to convince Biden to go with somebody who's going to take a more harsher line towards Iran, in order to make sure they get a future diplomatic back and forth with Iran that more suits their own strident politics.
Well, I think you're right that there is this tension between those forces in American politics and frankly abroad, specifically coming from Israel, that really wanted to provoke not just a high level of tension, but if it's possible, to provoke Iran into doing something that could justify a military response by the Trump administration. And that was really the biggest problem that we faced over the past couple of years. But with a Biden administration, I don't think that that's the fundamental problem anymore. Although you're right that the neoconservatives will continue to try to put pressure on Biden to move in that general direction. I think it's very clear that the real problem that we're going to have to deal with, we're going to have to expect to deal with in the case of the Biden administration, is the fact that you have a whole group of senior people within the administration, beginning with Tony Blinken, with Sullivan, the national security advisor, and with two or three others, including Bill Burns as the CIA director, who were, of course, key people within the Obama administration involved in making policy toward the Middle East and toward Iran, and specifically involved in the negotiation of the JCPOA. And I think the problem that we have to recognize here is that what they learned from the Obama administration experience in negotiating with Iran is the wrong lesson. They learned what they thought was the lesson, that they had the upper hand in forcing Iran to accept an agreement to limit their enrichment to a relatively low level. And they did that by virtue of the fact that they had these very strong, powerful economic sanctions that cut deeply into the Iranian economy, specifically the Iranian oil sales and banking. Those were the two key sectors of the economy that the Obama administration attacked with sanctions. Now, of course, you have a situation where the Biden administration has actually inherited even more powerful sanctions from the Trump administration. That is, the sanctions that were levied on Iran's actual oil exports. They were third country sanctions, meaning that the countries who were the customers of Iran's oil exports were the ones who were sanctioned. They were basically threatened with serious sanctions unless they stopped buying oil from Iran. And so it was extremely effective, and it basically reduced Iran's oil exports to a small fraction of what they had been. And so now I think we have a very serious problem with the Biden administration feeling, well, they are in the driver's seat more than ever before, and all they need to do is follow the model of their negotiations with Iran on the JCPOA under the Obama administration, and they will be able to get what they want, which is to force Iran to accept a new agreement, a new version of the JCPOA, no matter what you want to call it, that will impose longer timeframes on Iran, and will still give the United States the right, the power to force Iran to back off if it does anything that we don't like. And it will be the ideal situation for the United States. It will be another diplomatic triumph for a Democratic administration. And so this is the model that they have in mind. And there are already indications that that is the policy that they're hoping to begin with. Now, the problem, of course, is that Iran is never going to accept that. They're going to say, absolutely not. We're never going to sit down with you at all on the basis that you make that sort of demand. And the Iranians are going to make that public, and it won't get anywhere. It's going to just fall out of the sky. And so the question then becomes, where does the Biden administration go from there? I think we have an indication of what the next step, the second phase, would be, coming from Robert Einhorn, who was a senior State Department a State Department official under the Obama administration on weapons of mass destruction and WMD and nonproliferation. And he has said to the New York Times that his understanding is that the thinking is we will see the Biden administration try to get an agreement. It'll be something short of the JCPOA. It'll be a partial agreement in which they will get from the Iranians a retrogression, giving up some of the new uranium enrichment that they have carried out in violation of the original JCPOA, but after the Trump administration refused to participate in it. And in return, the United States would give up some of its present sanctions against Iran. So it would be a partial for partial agreement. And that would be, they'll just see how far they can go with that before they go any further. Now, I don't think Iran's going to go for that at all either, but that's what I think is going to be what we'll see for the next several months. And beyond that, it just depends on the political dynamics here at home and internationally and how the Iranians play their hand.
I think you're the appropriate person to ask this, because I would like to know, what do we know about the extent to which Iran has or has not complied with this nuclear agreement? I'm going to ask it in that way. I sound like an ignorant U.S. senator who is completely against the regime, as they would talk about them. But I suppose what I'm saying is, it's baffling to me the way that people like Jake Sullivan, who's now going to be this top advisor of Biden, and others in the administration would talk about Iran, because to me, it's actually the United States that should make concessions. In a civilized world, if we claim to be part of a civilized world, it would be us that made the concessions to Iran, because the United States left the agreement. We like Iran. To me, it seems very absurd, because Iran didn't do anything wrong, but it's like, in order for us to justify returning to the agreement, we're going to punish Iran and force them to give up more to get back into a deal that they never even really wanted to be in with to begin with, because it all rested upon a lot of misinformation and disinformation about the extent of their nuclear program, which, as you've documented in Manufactured Crisis, didn't exactly exist.
Well, you're absolutely right. There couldn't be anything clearer than this, that it was the United States that violated the agreement from the very beginning. And when Trump left the agreement, the fact is that Iran did not then immediately say, okay, we're out. We're going to go ahead and do whatever we want in terms of uranium enrichment, and start, doing high-level uranium enrichment if we feel like it. No, they stayed in complete compliance with the JCPOA for not quite 2 years, but most of 2 years. And they did so very deliberately, so that they could come with a clean conscience to the international community when they finally decided that they'd had enough, that it was time for them to say, okay, we are going to begin to retreat from our own commitments under the agreement, because the United States has completely torn it up, and we're the ones who have been suffering the consequences. So we're going to begin to go back to enrichment of uranium. And they did that, and they did it in stages over the last 2 years. Not over the last 2 years, over the last year. And ultimately, it led to, once again, beginning to enrich uranium at 20%, which, of course, as many of your listeners will know, if not all of them, is what was a red line for the Obama administration. It was one of the reasons why the Obama administration felt that it was urgent to get the JCPOA, because this was viewed as a signal that Iran was getting closer and closer to having the capability to have a bomb. And of course, the Iranians deliberately did that, because they knew that it was an American red line, and it was a way of getting the attention of the Americans and really putting diplomatic pressure on them. And as I point out in the article that I've just written, and which will be published by Grayzone either today or tomorrow, this was the way that Iran actually got the United States to negotiate on terms that were acceptable to Iran, and that ultimately resulted in the JCPOA. When the United States, when the Obama administration went into those negotiations originally, it was going to take the position that Iran had no right to enrich at all, that it was basically a matter of Iran giving up any idea of having a peaceful nuclear program, and having the status of no enrichment whatsoever. They were not willing to accept that. They had never accepted the principle that they didn't have the right to enrich. And so they went ahead with their own enrichment up to 20%. And the United States ultimately gave in, despite the fact that it had this weapon of the very harsh sanctions that it felt was going to be sufficient to force Iran to give in. And the result was an agreement that was much more even-handed than the Obama administration had originally planned. So I think the lesson here is that the Iranians are very willing to go the extra mile in order to show their good faith. But ultimately, they are going to defend their interests, and they're going to do so in a very careful way that is consistent ultimately with their, as you correctly put it, their commitment that they are not interested in nuclear weapons. They will never have weapons of mass destruction of any kind. And you're right, I did document the evidence of that, which is absolutely ironclad and goes back all the way to the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s, when they could have had weapons of mass destruction in the form of chemical weapons and were not allowed to by Khomeini, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was then the supreme leader of Iran. And so there's absolutely no doubt, there's no room for doubt that Iran is serious about its commitment not to ever have any weapon of mass destruction.
So I have a couple questions I just want to work in here from people who are watching, and then we'll get to Blinken, and it'll probably be about the time to wrap up our conversation here. But I have a couple specific questions. I have one person who was curious if Iran's testing of its intermediate range missiles, do we know if that was directly in response to the B-52 flights? Is there a tit for tat here in what we've been seeing play out?
I don't know the answer to that, but it's certainly possible that that the Iranians did in fact do that. The timing of it could indicate that they wanted to have a response to the B-52 flights. Absolutely, it's quite credible. No doubt about that. And
then the other thing is, I have a question about sanctions and just noting the policy. I saw some analysis that was done by Bloomberg, of all media organizations, that found that the Trump administration was issuing sanctions against countries, not just Iran, but others, on average 3 times a day, going back to 2017, that it was that frequent in how the Treasury Department was applying sanctions to, however they were doing it. Some of them were to specific officials, some of them were less targeted. And my question to you is where you see this economic warfare fitting. To me, this is the key bipartisan consensus. I think I heard a little bit of this in your answer earlier, but I want to bring this out more particularly because we know this seems to be the one area of consensus between the more centrist liberals who are involved in foreign policy in Joe Biden's administration, and then obviously those lingering right-wing Republicans who are still going to try to advance their own agenda, even if it's futile for them to keep pressing. People like Tom Cotton, who we can expect to keep being loudmouths, even though they're not going to get what they want in the end. But what I think they will be able to do, them and people like Marco Rubio and others, is that they will get these sanctions that they want on Iran. So we already have quite a few. And I guess my question is, what's there to reassess and what's there to change? I mean, the line of argument that you'd get from someone like Antony Blinken, who's the Secretary of State nominee, is that perhaps they didn't do these appropriately or they weren't done smart enough. That's always, to me, the Democratic response, is that somehow the Republicans were so aggressive and cowboy-like in the way that they did it that we just need to fine tune it. And then once we get it just right, we're going to get the response from our official enemy that we want. And it just seems to me like a lot's already been done. So even when you're considering what they could put on the table, I guess how far is there to even go in order to get a reaction that you would want from Iran? It seems like they've already cranked it up pretty high. And so anything Iran's going to do is going to be because they've already managed to insulate themselves from our own sanctions regime.
Well, a couple of responses to that very interesting and important question. One is that I think it's important to understand that the real difference here, at least in my view, between the right-wing Republican neoconservatives and now the present Biden administration elite group on foreign policy is that they view what the Trump administration did as a sort of scattershot diplomacy. In other words, Pompeo's demands on Iran were all over the place. He was making all kinds of demands on Iran with the same status, no sort of distinction in terms of sequencing or anything like that. And it was clearly not, what Pompeo did was clearly done in a manner that suggested they weren't really interested in negotiating with Iran at all. But the Democrats are saying, we don't have any problem with the sanctions. We just want to have, we're going to have much more focused demands that we believe that we can achieve. And I think that's the danger here, that they want to use the same sanctions and they believe that they're going to use them much more effectively. The problem is that Iran now in 2021 is not the Iran that the United States was facing in 2012 or 2014 or 2015 or 2016. They now have military options, as they showed in 2019, 2020, that make them much more capable of resisting pressures by the United States. So the United States has, practically speaking, not just fewer options, but no real military option. The Iranians are not going to be subject to military pressures anymore. And so it's the economic sanctions which have replaced the threat of military action for the United States as the imperialist tool. Mm-hmm. That's the stage that we are at. And I think the more we focus on that, the more we understand that, the more effective opposition can become in terms of the policy that I think is going to unfold from the Biden administration in the coming months.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the challenge for those of us who are concerned about where this could all go, because there are many who point out the devastation that is ongoing as a result of those sanctions on the civilian population. And we've seen very clearly with the pandemic what Iran isn't able to do in order to take care of its people. And with people in the United States very viscerally feeling it themselves, I think we can put ourselves in their shoes and imagine if we had a government that didn't want to do anything to address it. But imagine if we had a government that couldn't, because there was another power that was preventing them from getting the supplies and the medicine and other things that they need in order to deal with taking care of their own people. I mean, I feel like just knowing the culture that we have in this country, people would be completely irate and incensed, and there'd be rebellion against this kind of a thing. I do have a question here, and I really did want to quote Blinken before I had you go and walk through one of his statements on Iran. But I have a good question from a journalist friend who asks, what is the reason the Obama administration decided to secure the Iran nuclear deal in the first place? Was it because they wanted to shift focus toward China and slowly dislocate the United States from the Israeli Sunni Arab monarchy alliance? I just find this a very interestingly framed question. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about, what the interest was as far as like empire goes to even have the deal.
That's a very good question. I mean, my own view, based on really following the negotiations from the very beginning to the very end, I was in Vienna for the final phase of the negotiations, is that that the Obama administration was really focused on Iran as the primary test of the entire administration in terms of foreign policy, because of the degree to which the United States under Obama had really made Iran the pivotal issue. And again, I believe they were so overconfident of their ability to shape the outcome, to force Iran to come to heel, if you will, by the fact that they had this new sanctions tool that they were so convinced was unprecedented in its ability to cut into Iran's economy, that they had no doubt that they were going to win this. And that's why they chose to center the attention of the American public and the rest of the world on the outcome in the JCPOA negotiations. And the reason that, again, that they lost was that they simply underestimated the degree to which Iran was able to maneuver, to use its own ability to enrich uranium at a higher level, and to suggest that they were going to continue that, and to make that look like it would be a major failure for the United States, to get the United States to be more agreeable in the negotiations. And if you follow the entire history of the negotiations, you'll see that that was a key turning point when the United States gave up its demand for Iran to have zero enrichment. And so, I mean, I think that, again, it comes back to fundamental lack of understanding on the part of the Obama administration, and a very clever use of sort of reverse leverage by the Iranians, using their enrichment program as a diplomatic tool. And they've done that from the very beginning of the enrichment program. It's never been understood by the US government fully, but that's been the secret of their entire use of enrichment. That's what they wanted to do from the very beginning, was to use it as a set of negotiating chips with the United States.
All right, so here is Antony Blinken's answer. I'll read it off to you. And essentially, this came up when he was asked. I believe the senator who asked him about it is from the state where I was born, Indiana. This is Todd Young, who asked him about Iran, but there were other senators that had questions about Iran, and certainly Menendez, who is a kind of APAC hawk, was very insistent that Blinken come back and talk with him about a way that they could negotiate a completely different nuclear deal, and he does not favor the JCPOA. But Blinken said, and I think it's really worth it to have you specifically engage with what he said would be the kinds of approach that Biden would take going forward here. Blinken said that the president-elect Joe Biden has stated, if Iran returns to compliance with the JCPOA, we would do the same thing. And I don't know what he's vaguely referring to, but he would use this as a platform, working with our allies and partners to build a longer and stronger agreement that would capture some of the other issues that need to be dealt with regard to missiles, with regard to Iran's activities, and he calls them destabilizing activities in the region. So obviously, a lot of senators were highlighting these kinds of things that McKenzie has been pushing, it sounds like. And he says, having said that, I think there's a lot that Iran will need to do to come back into compliance. So this goes back to what I was saying earlier. We would then have to evaluate whether they'd actually done so. So I don't think that it's happening tomorrow or the next day. So in other words, he's very clearly letting people know that the return to the agreement we're not even talking about this year. It could be next year by the time that we return. So then one more thing I would add is he was asked by Young, do you believe, based on the connection that Secretary Pompeo makes between Iran and al-Qaeda? So on the way out, it's important to catch people up that Mike Pompeo was lobbying this thing that I know you've been tracking closely, that's on par with the allegations that somehow Saddam was aligned with al-Qaeda. Like they were doing an equivalent of that to Iran and trying to tie Iran to al-Qaeda. And so he asked if the Trump or a Biden administration would have the authority to strike Iran, or do you instead adopt this interpretation that if deemed necessary to engage in any sort of military action, we would need to pass a new authorization bill in Congress. So he's asking if they already have the authority to go to war, the Biden administration, because that's what's on the mind of Republicans. And Blinken says he believes they would need a separate authorization. But this is interesting. And this is probably the most concerning aspect about watching Blinken's confirmation hearing, is just how accommodating he is of all of these right-wing foreign policy talking points. He said to this Republican senator, I haven't had a chance to see what the underlying basis is for Pompeo claiming that there's some kind of link. But if it's true, we would have to take it very, very seriously. Al-Qaeda leadership has been in Iran for some time at various points. They didn't have the full freedom of movement. At other points, it may have had the leash taken off a little bit, but what Secretary Pompeo cited publicly is something I would be very concerned with, but I have to look at what is underneath that. So clearly he has no idea. He doesn't know anything about this particular claim, but he's going to leave it out as a possibility, which I think is really dangerous.
Well, first of all, I would say, there's some of this has to do with the inclination of any person who needs to be confirmed to be very agreeable with the people who are questioning him. That's part of it. I don't think that's all of it. I think you're right that he has a tendency to accept a lot of the propaganda about Iran. I don't think that's unique to Blinken. I think that was a general quality that was to be found in virtually all of the senior Obama administration officials who dealt with Iran. I think Bill Burns might be a bit more sober than some of the others because of his background in the State Department. And, I think that he is more level-headed, but I think there's a tendency to do that. And I think that is disconcerting. But again, I would just point out that fundamentally, I think we're dealing with a new administration here that has not learned the right lesson of their own experience in dealing with Iran in the past. And I think that's really the most dangerous thing that people need to take into account and really follow closely.
Yeah, to me, I think that's very clear because I think one of the more essential points that you made, if I could just put an exclamation point on it as I let you go, is this fact that they're going in this and trying to do everything that they did under Obama all over again. And there's a lot that has shifted. And also, we should just expect that the antagonism shown towards Iran is put them in a position where they're going to have to demand more dignity and respect from the negotiators who diplomatically go in there and try to nail down the agreement. And I think the other thing that we haven't really talked about is where these European nations that didn't leave the agreement come into play, and where they fit into all of this, because wasn't the JCPOA wasn't a bilateral agreement. It had other parties who tried to salvage some of it even without the Trump administration. And so does that mean that they're sympathetic to Iran, or does that mean that they end up taking the side of the Biden administration in pressuring Iran to, or like, do they recognize that something happened over the last 4 years that was profoundly unjust in the way that the Trump administration targeted them for, because there's countries that wanted to have trade with Iran that were disrupted because of the way that the Trump administration retaliated?
Well, it's a very good question and not a simple one because, the European three, UK, Germany, and France, have fluctuated over the years between all-out support for the United States at certain times and really being highly concerned about the United States at other times. And, part of it was whether they were afraid that the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, was going to go to war against Iran. And when they were satisfied about that, they tended to get back in line under Obama. And now I think we're seeing a new period in which you have the German foreign minister, particularly, being very aggressive about putting pressure on Iran over issues of their missile program, particularly. And, I see, that's going to be a problem in the future where the Europeans are essentially, I don't know if I should say putting pressure on, but encouraging the Biden administration to take a very tough line on this. I think they will be part of the reason why they continue to move toward a much harder line. and why there will be a reckoning here at some point in the Biden administration over the next year to 2 years, or maybe even sooner, that we'll see some kind of crisis, no matter how serious, maybe only mildly serious, over demands by the Obama administration that are refused, and sort of both sides kind of escalating the rhetoric and so forth. We just don't know at this point how that's going to play out. That's a very troubling prospect.
All right. Well, we'll have to stay connected. And as there are major developments, I hope to be able to talk to you along the way. Everyone who's watching, Gareth's somebody I relied on during the Trump administration to see us through very clearly, especially as we saw the more liberal Democratic side go along with some of the belligerence of the Trump administration, and in fact, cheer it. And it's one of the few times that we had applause for Donald Trump was when he was attacking or bombing these Middle Eastern countries, whether they were just for show. Sometimes he was just demonstrating that we have this hardware. It wasn't even for any strategic goal. But thank you. And again, for everyone, you're on Twitter at Gareth Porter. Go read his article later today or tomorrow at the Grayzone, which will be about Iran. And again, this article that we talked about is called How CENTCOM Chief McKenzie. Hold on, scrolling up to the top to get this headline for people so that they can find it on Google if they would need to do so. It is How CENTCOM Chief McKenzie manufactured an Iran crisis to increase his power. And that was about a week ago. There's been, Donald Trump's no longer president, but I think it's still relevant to catching people up to where we are right now as the Biden administration moves onward. So thank you, Gareth, and you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Glad to be on your show.